Hi.
Uh, Today I will talk about the art of editing chapter 2, the editor and the audience. My name is Huang Yun. This chapter has four parts. First is newspapers update and journalism readiness and connecting and understanding audience and evaluating the mediums. First, do anyone know this person? He is the investor, Warren Buffett, and by he has by 62 newspapers, dailies and weeks, and they have a bet. People will pay for the information they can get about their local communities only from the local newspapers. Newspapers, particularly those in small communities, have a connection with their readers that others, particularly their more political counterparts, lack. And the And they think the newspaper industry make a big mistake by giving away their content on free websites, but the strategy is reversible. Maybe they think online newspaper or online website should allow anyone to read 10 free articles a month but charge for that. Print subscribers get access to online sites for a minimum monthly fee. So they think newspapers should have their cost, and there's a mistake to give free. And newspapers, particularly in the idea at present is to keep the newspaper healthy while gradually increasing online revenue. So the newspapers won't die, and it has still have life. So, if Warren Buffett is right, it is possible we could be the cost of a journalism renaissance. Richard Gingras, a head of news products at Google, he asked 8 questions to suggest how journalism might be reshaped. And if you are interested in it, you can see more. But now I will talk about one of these problems. First is the editors and their audience are often too disconnected. Recently, status from the Newspaper Association of America shows that only 34.6% of 25 to 34-year-old Americans read newspapers daily. The percentage of 66.1% for those 18 to 24. For the editor or publisher trying to ensure the newspaper's future, it is equally devastating, but it is viewed shared by many school-age children. Newspapers, they believe, are boring and written for older people, and simply not relevant to their lives. But the electronic newspapers changed this. Online media has a chance to turn that attitude around. After the 2-year-old of electoral and junior high school students, researchers conduct that computer-based media could convert young people into news consumers, not into newspapers readers. Clearly, young people are more willing and more eager to consume their information from a computer screen than the print age. If young people are disconnected from the media, so too are many adults. Study after study shows that the public views journalists that we discussed. Journalists as a whole are ranked among the least popular of professional groups, often below politicians and used car voters. So this is why we need a revolution, and we need to do our best to let us trust us. And the second one is advertising promotes change. Audience fragmentation is fed by advertisers' desire to reach target segments of the reading, listening, and viewing audience, like they disparate like teenagers, young adults, even more details like cyclists and exercise addicts. So, the target marketing also go after those who can afford or buy those who need the product. It's more often like appeared in magazines. Like magazines have depart this with titles like life, beauty, sports, and a lot of different audience were attracted by these titles. If you are interested in beauty, you will buy the beauty like Vogue. If you ask like sports, you will just buy the sports magazines. And the online media is also like this. And the computer-based media are able to tell advertisers actually how many people read an ad for how long. Even more significant, they are able to tell those advertisers demographic and the profile for firm sale lead. And so the advertisers are willing to pay for them. And the last one is media in turmoil. Not only are great shifts taking place, the impact of one medium versus another, but the arrival of new media forms have completed the situation. All this has led to increased emphasis on the packaging and the marketing of media products. And so there is argue here. Newspapers editors eagerness to reconnect with useful readers. The young page editor explained that they decided that they would give their readers things they wanted to read, not only things they think they would read. The pounding to the marketing concept of simply giving people what they want. But somebody argued that the critic says media are a public trust and should be above the pressure of marketing. So this means the media should tell the reality and they shouldn't pursue the marketing. So there is a conflict. The reality is that the broadcast programs and newspapers are products must be marketed if they want to survive. And there is a good examples like the newspapers, the revolution of newspapers. Because we disconnected with our audience, so we need to connecting them and understand them again. The editors at traditional media outlets often fail to understand the increasing percentage of today's media consumers want to interact with editors about the events occurring around them. Getting information with no opportunity for feedbacks is simply not satisfying. Like in the newspapers, if you want to connect with editors, you just can use later call, and maybe now has internet, you can email and send them. And some newspapers pays the editors email address under the title, so you can send an email to them if you have some suggestions, opinions. And the broadcaster just can call later and talk radio, and in televisions are just call and letter and the internal criticism. And the internet is more like site forums, chat rooms, and website record and blogs. And the good editors recognize there are ways to connect with audience. So they encourage their audience to talk to them. And there are some tips to measuring audience reaction. And the readership studies often used in newspapers and magazines. Some things measure tips tools is articles, photos, graphics, and other features. And the focus groups is used and representative groups discussed with readers. You can benefit from this. And the radio and the TV is listen rating determine the relative popularity of programs and shows. And there is an example of understanding the USA audience. Researchers tell editors much about their audience consumers news. If you want to know more, you can search more studies. And now I will talk about 2 points. Credibility and the media. Just now we talk about the editors. They don't trust and or believe the journalist because there are some inaccuracy and spelling and grammar mistakes, and the station story are exciting but not important. One must know exciting and important is difference, because something may be exciting but it's not very important to the audience life. So the editors must know which stories will attract their audience, and the media are assessed to be best. Maybe we should be objective. And the second is follow the times and keep with the followings. Change the needs and all of changing consumers. If the media industry are changing, so are the lives of media consumers. If your consumers are changed, the editors must change. So the editors must know and understand your audience, what they think and what they changed and what they want. So you need to read everything they can find about their communities, and keep an open ear to topics like discussions at the local club. And some editors have tried their means of taking plus of community, including formal readership studies. Just say about it, and open formulas of focus groups, representatives, examples of media consumers assembled into small discussion groups. And last one is about the evaluating the media mix. In the information age, no one suggested that the desire for information will win. Instead, the main question is how that information will be consumed. But the problem is, no media is doing a good job of satisfying the public's thirst for information. Perhaps that's because no one media has all technological advantages. Like radio, television, newspapers, magazines, they all have their own disadvantages. So compared to this, Internet may be the best one. Internet allows editors to overcome almost limitations and adopt these good traits, which is why many consider the medium of the future. They say the Internet will be the medium of the future. As the news breaks, it goes on the website immediately. Then, as the deadline for the print education or news broadcast nears, that same news is packaged or repackaged for the newspaper or newscast. So this is why we should know how to make news or how to edit news in both in websites and newspapers. Newspapers and televisions and the Internet are evolving into a new info media that combines the best attributes of them all. Wise young journalists of today should therefore view themselves not just a print journalist, online journalist, or broadcast, but as information provider equipped to provide news or other information messages in whatever form the audience desire. After all, what is important is message or the way it is delivered. That's all about my presentation. Thank you for watching. Thank you for paying attention.
Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting topic, particularly as it relates to the survival of newspapers. They are closing down quite a few newspapers in America already, especially the smaller ones. However, there is the theory, as Buffett suggested, that local news has an advantage and that they'll always have an audience. That's a nice theory. I'm not sure it's true. But I'm sure it's only true if they can adapt. Let me put it that way. If they can adapt, then they might survive. The smaller newspapers, I used to own a small newspaper, and I do know that the community wanted it badly enough that a lot of advertisers advertised even though they didn't think the advertising was doing them any good. Now I tried to change that, and I increased, I made them a better deal so that they would feel like their advertising really was doing them some good, and so it was not just charity. But my point is that they really wanted a local newspaper, but it cost a lot to put out a newspaper, and I don't know that that desire will be enough to overcome the challenges of maintaining a newspaper. The local newspapers also have some limitations on their staffing. How much they can change over into a web-first publication will be a challenge also. But it is important that they try. Otherwise, I'm sure they will die. There are some things about newspapers that I think are important in understanding how to save them. One is that they have to not just be web-first, but web-better. There are they need to understand the advantages of a web newspaper and actually get their readers to go to the web first because it's better. It's a better product. So how can a newspaper be better on the internet than it can in print? Well, for one thing, it can have more video. It can have video and audio. It can't do that in print. And so, as was suggested, the reporters themselves have to change their mind, the way they think. They have to do video. They may even have to change the way they interact with their sources, because now they want to do some of the interview on video. And so if you're an investigative reporter, the person may not want to be in video. But in most stories, investigative type stories represent far less than 10% of your stories, especially in a local newspaper. So I don't think video will be a problem to turn on the video while you're interviewing somebody. And then, in your news story, you'll only be using some of the quotes. But in your online version, you can put the entire interview if you want to. You can also do, a lot of newspapers with their top stories are making their stories into a video without even changing the words. I don't know if that's the best way of doing it, but they're just reading their story in essence. They have a professional talking head that's putting their story into a video format. And I find myself sometimes watching the video, even though it's just a talking head reading the story. But if they have a decent talking head, that's okay. I'm lazy or whatever, so I turn it on and listen to the story rather than reading it. Although I may also be going through and double checking to see if they added any more information into the printed version. There's also, what else can you do? One thing you should be doing, especially because they're dying of lack of advertising, is to do video advertising. Very few I don't know of any newspapers that's offering video advertising. And yet all the executives say that video advertising is the most powerful form of advertising. So why are they not offering video advertising on their online version? They should be. Some newspapers have a hard time deciding whether or not to allow ads on their news site to link to an advertiser's website. They're afraid that the advertiser will take a very small ad and then link to their website, which has has everything, has their entire inventory, and so forth. But if they don't do it, and Facebook and Google and everybody else online is allowing people to buy small ads and then link to their entire website, that puts newspapers at a disadvantage. So that's probably not a smart thing to do, preventing them from linking to their website. You should probably encourage it, because ultimately you need your advertisers to be happy. And so, as I mentioned, at first when I bought my first newspaper, advertisers were treating me like a charity. They wanted a local newspaper, so they were buying ads, but they did not believe in the advertising of that small newspaper. And so I made them a much better deal, and signed them up for a year-long contract and gave them a lot of freebies along with the contract, to where they saw it totally differently. And then I doubled my revenue because I treated them differently. And so anything you can do to make your advertisers happy, the more likely they're going to advertise with you. And advertising is what pays the bills for most newspapers and magazines too, as far as that goes. So whatever they can do to make them happy, they should be doing. Another thing you can do with your online newspaper are things that you can't do with your print newspaper, is link to lots of other resources. You can link to ebooks. If you have a story about the election, can you find a YouTube video that talks about how people are elected here in Malaysia, and link it to a YouTube video? You don't even have to do it yourself. If you think it's a good video, you just have to link to it. That explains how the Prime Minister is selected and so forth. So there are ways to enhance what you can offer them on the web, the internet, and you need to think about that. Another thing that you can do is, at least all the major websites are collecting your data, you know that. But one reason why they collect your data is to personalize their service to you. So if you go to Amazon, for example, they remember what books you like if you're shopping for books on Amazon. And so next time you come looking for books, they immediately bring up a whole bunch of books they think that you might like, because they personalize their service towards you based on the data they've collected from your previous visits. Newspapers can do the same thing, not just with advertising, but with their front page. If they have in essence, a front page to their newspaper, they can't put every story or every link on their front page. So what do they feature on their front page? Eventually they need to learn how to personalize, just like the marketers do. So what I see on the front page when I go to a newspaper, an online newspaper, is different than what you see, because I'm looking for different types of stories. I'm going to be looking for the sports section, and most of you women probably won't be looking for the sports section. So my front page will include at least the top sports story, or the top, and it will even tell them, it'll keep track of whether, do I like basketball or do I like football? Do I like, how often do I go look at baseball? Or is there a time of the year when I look at baseball, and other times of the year I don't look at baseball? They can track all of that and then personalize my experience with their online newspaper. So there are lots of things that can be done with an online newspaper that are not being done. Consequently, I think it's a professor from, can't remember, the Arizona State University or University of Arizona, one of the big Arizona universities, who concluded that newspapers might as well just stop their online versions, because nobody's going to it. They don't have any, nobody is transitioning right now to the online version, hardly at all, hardly any of the newspapers. But again, there's a reason why, because it's not worth going to. If you make your online version worth going to, then they will go to it. But that means doing something extra. You can't do the same thing. You can't just put what you put in the newspaper online and expect them to go online. There's some that will, but most won't. What you'd really like to do is see people, more of a group of people that do both. So by offering extra things online, and maybe even rewriting some of your stories a little bit, making the story a little bit different when you put it online. You maybe put it on print first, and then as soon as the print version is going to press, you start rewriting your stories and adding some more quotes and updating them and making them a follow-up story rather than the original story. And so suddenly now they read the story in the print and they start understanding after a short period of time, I can go to the website and get a more updated version. So now they'll start reading both stories, not just the printed story, they'll read the online story too, because they want more information about it. When there's something big going on, like an election, I read every story I can find about it. And so why not with the same newspaper? Print version and online version being in the more updated version, and so forth. So there are lots of things that they can do, but right now they're failing. They're failing miserably. I think I mentioned in a recent book chapter, doing my research for it, I went to the corporate website of the newspaper chain that I used to work for, McClatchy, and I looked up their annual corporate report, and they were really bragging about how much better they were doing online. Well, yeah, they had almost doubled their online usage, but that meant they increased their revenue, their online revenue from 4% of their entire revenue to 6%. Well, yeah, that's a 50% increase, but it's nowhere close to supplementing all the advertising they're losing online. And so thus, for that reason, they lost $30 million last year. So they're doing better, but they lost $30 million. That's not something to brag about. And that's the problem. And McClatchy does follow the Buffett idea, in theory anyway, of going with local newspapers. They don't have any of the big metropolitan newspapers. They have lots of smaller local newspapers, and yet they're still losing $30 million a year and bragging about it. So I don't know. So they're going to have to make some changes or they're dead. Okay, do we have another presentation today? Okay. Right.
Hello, people. Journalism student, I think this presentation you must listen and you need to pay attention because this is the basic thing that if you want to work as a journalist in the future. And yes, the presentation will be about editing process. And first I will say something about the executive board and the editing process, and I will use case study to illustrate this process. And the third part will be a hot topic, right? Recently is the elimination of the copy desk in New York Times. And last, I will present my source. So I think most of you sitting here, you must have some basic understanding on what is editing. And for me, I want to clarify is that editing is not the science that answers yes or no questions. It's also an art that needs good judgment and also discretion. So here's the executive board of the newsroom. We got publisher, executive editor, managing editor, also assistant, managing editor, and then under that is the content editor, and also the topic desk chef, and then a reporter and copy editor. It's quite complicated, right? So I will use the case study. I want that this model, this organizational chart is not like 100% the same as the book, the textbook, the art of editing. So I have made some adjustment that is more suitable for right now for this for the tendency of the newsroom right now. And I use a case study I choose the New York Times example because of its prominent position in the range of newspaper. So in 2017, the average weekday circulation of the New York Times was 540,000 copies, with more than 1,450 journalists reporting from more than 160 countries every year, which makes the New York Times definitely stand out among all other news outlets. And also one of the best, so it's also an best example for this presentation. Since we all know that this is like a complex media company, so I will take only the news department in the New York Times as example, not other department like the advertising department, etc. So are you ready to follow me? Give me some response. All right. So here comes first is the publisher. The publisher is someone who tops the organizational ladder and is ultimately responsible for the overall operation in the news paper, including both the journalistic and the business operation. And in New York Times case, the publisher right now is the author Geek Sulzberger, and he became the publisher at the beginning of this year. And he's the one who leads the company, and he's the one who set up the strategy for the company. He directs the vision of the entire company, entire New York Times, and he oversees also both the newsroom and also the company operations. So actually in the micro perspective, in a news department perspective, he will supervise the executive editor to make sure that the next morning newspaper come out to the best. And then depending on the size of newsroom, a newspaper may have numerous editor, but always comes from the executive editor first. Executive editor is also called editor or called editor-in-chief. He's responsible for all editorial content of the newspaper. Here, the editorial content is different from the editorial page, which that contains the letters from the readers or the outside of the editorial. So for the executive editor, he can hire and fire the heads of different newsroom department. So in New York Times case, under Sulzberger's supervision, the executive editor is the Dean Bucket. Mr. Bucket serving the highest rank position in a newsroom in New York Times, and he also oversees the New York Times news reports in all of the various forms, which including the print and also the web version. And so immediately below Mr. Sulzberger is the managing editor. Sometimes in the big operation, they will have assistant managing editor for him. So the managing editor is someone who typically the person that directly charge the newsroom and managing its news operation and also the budget. And the assistant manager will be responsible for specific area of coverage. In other words, that managing editor is the person who oversees the day-to-day operation of the news division. For example, he will in charge of the sport desk, he will in charge of the photo desk, and also state desk, national desk. All the desk editor will have to respond to report to the managing editor. So in New York Times case, is the Steve Kemp. He's managing editor, which is the second ranked title for him in this newsroom. He can hire and fire and promote staff members. And other responsibilities for him include creating and enforcing the deadline, and also enforcing the policy that's set by the publisher or by the executive editor. And then the managing editor supervises two division. First is the content editor, and then the copy desk. So right now I will explain the copy desk chief first. The copy desk chief is someone in charge of the copy desk, and he is also called news editor or the slow person. He needs to reread, rewrite, or review the whole page before he print out. And he also needs to teach the ring editor how to do the job, the paper that wants them to. But I think most of you have some, maybe you're quite confused about what is the slow person or what is the ring editor. And here's the, demonstration for this. It's like before 1960s, the copy desk was like the horseshoes. And then inside the ring is the slow person, which is the copy desk chief, and then outside the copy editor who's sitting outside is called ring editor. And the slow editor, who is standing in the middle, is like generally considered the last line of defense. Right now, the desk have been changed. You know, the organization of newsroom is completely different, but the roles of the slow person and also the ring editor has remained till now. So sometimes, like only one editor will in the slot, but often there are 2 or 3 in a big news operation. And if the time is limited, actually the slow only review the headline before he hit the typeset key, which send the whole newspaper to the final step. And then also under the managing editor is also the content editor, who is also called assigning editor in New York Times case, and also that from the textbook is also called assigning editor. For the assigning editor or content editor, they work closely with the reporter to craft a story for the web and also the print version, and they also decide which reporter should be resigned to the job. A different content editor is in charge of different desks. For example, for New York Times case, they have maybe work desk, work content editor, business editor, technology editor, and also like health editor. So every day, actually different, all of the editor, they will have a front page meeting, maybe with the executive editor or with the copy desk chair or managing editor. And basically the content editor from different desks, they will want their story to be on the front page, right? So they will sit together and like maybe have a polite debate within each other, and then they will decide which story will go on the front page. But the final decision, the final say on the decision were made by them. And then is the copy editor, who is under the copy desk chief. And copy is a journalistic term for text. So beside them, the copy editor is also called the ring editor, I just mentioned before, and they need to carry out assignment that given to them by the copy desk chief. Beside an excellent command of language, the copy editor actually they should have a broad knowledge that can for them to be able to suspect inaccurate information. There are like thousands of goals for the copy editor, but the goal for this copy editor is to get the message correctly and quickly. Here's a quote from the Bestie Wade, who is the former chief of the foreign desk, copy desk in New York Times. He said that copy editor, in the view of practitioners, are the people who keep written or spoken news first factually correct, second understandable, and then third to the point, last grammatically fluent when possible. And here's how a page looks like after being edited. And once the editor has finished editing the reporter's raw copy, the copy editor will send this to the copy desk. But this is not done yet. This is not ready to print. This is the final step for them. This is the final step that the page must be through. It's called the proofreading. A proof is different from a copy. A proof is a copy of the complete page and is ready to print except for any last-minute correction you may be able to make. So after the copy desk has laid out the page, added the story, and written the headline and other big type and set them to print, one editor or some editor will called on to check over the page one last time before sending them off to printing department. In the proofreading stage, the editor just check over the page, and then they were only looking for some small mistake that even easy for the reader to spot. So you can see that here's some 6 and also 7. This is some very simple thing. And also that the proofreading symbol will be different, a little bit different from the copy editing symbols. And the main difference between the proofreading and then the copy editing is that for the proofreading process, they don't have the time to change a lot. They don't have the time to continue editing. They don't have the time to rewrite the whole story, except for in case of the emergency. And then I think some of you may know this heated topic is a recent decision that made by the New York Times. They decided to eliminate half of the newspaper's stand-alone copy desk. They say that it's a part of the broader efforts at the Times that to restructure the operation of the newsroom. Also, that it's an attempt to reduce its long-standing system of layers of editing, which is that only created for the print area. And also, they will use the saving from these cuts to bring in more reporters and other journalists who can build a report that acknowledge the changing world of journalists. But on the opposite, that hundreds of Times employees staged a walkout on the following Thursday afternoon to protest the cut. I don't know how you feel about this, but I don't think that it is a good decision, because from my perspective, especially in this area, in this era that fake news is overwhelming, and we need the fact-checking. Fact-checking is more important than ever. We need someone, an independent eyes on the story before publication. We need someone who is professional in writing headline, checking facts, and also the source. We need someone that can clarify confusion for us and make sure that story meets journalistic standard. So the copy text or the copy editor that represent not only the reader but also the organization's reputation. We all know that there's a division between the reporter, the copy editor, and also the content editor. This division had been long enough, and it had been applied successfully for more than a century, especially in large newspaper. So whether the experiment of the New York Times will work out is still under the suspicion. But the result, that whether it fail or it success, will give us and also give other news outlets a hint on what is the future of copy editing and what is the future of the journalism in this digitalized world. And here is the source I used for this presentation, and I used the textbook, of course, and then some news and some third-party source. That's it for my presentation. Thank you. I already sent this to your email, this file.
Well, in this case, we could just
All right.
do a save as, actually, if it's still up. You already closed it? Okay. Well, send it to me later.
All right.
Remember, some of you haven't, both the presenters today didn't catch that you're supposed to, at the end, have some questions and the right answers. So do remember to do that. So if both presenters today would send those to me, I won't deduct as much as I might otherwise. Just 3 to 5 is all I'm looking for, but questions with the answers that they would review with you at the end of their presentation, and that can go beyond the 15 minutes. The Q&A can go beyond the 15 minutes, but and those Q&As can show up in your quizzes and or tests. So you should be paying attention to those. Just a couple of comments on the last presentation here. I know how hard she worked, because she made me work quite a bit on this presentation. She had lots of questions. It's very complicated. As I was explaining to her, every newspaper is going to be different. There are certain trends you can see, but the newspaper I worked for had 50,000 circulation and 50 people in the newsroom. New York Times is 540 circulation and 500 and something people in the newsroom. So it looked kind of proportional, doesn't it? Basically, for every 1,000 circulation, they can afford, in theory, afford one more person in the newsroom. And so if you have 540 or whatever people in your newsroom, you have to have a different organization than a place that has 50 people in its newsroom. And so there's more layers of content editors, for example. The main layers in the medium-sized newspaper I was at were, the Metro editor handled most of the reporters, but there was also a sports editor. He even though it's you'd think, gee, sports isn't that important, he had a lot of people reporting to him. Some of the people were part-timers, but they had lots of sports reporters because it's very important to a local newspaper to cover their local sports, not just national and international sports, but their local sports. Very important to them. And so they had a sports editor. They did have a features editor. And I think, and a photo editor. That was pretty much it, I think, as far as content. Everything else went through the Metro editor. If there was any distinction, so there wasn't a separate education editor. There was not a separate national editor. If you would say there was one, it was me, and I was the wire editor. But we had no reporters, so you didn't really call it, I wasn't called the national editor because I had no reporters. In that sense, I was not a content editor. I was working with no reporters. I was just looking at the wire services and deciding which wire stories to run in the newspaper. That's it. So in that sense, then obviously a smaller, medium-sized newspaper like the one I was at has a much different structure than the New York Times. There are also daily papers in America, like I said, even daily papers that have like 5,000 circulation. Well, you can expect the newspaper with 5,000 circulation to have a lot smaller organization than the newspaper I was at with 50,000 circulation. And so they probably had, with their 5,000 circulation, may have had only 5 people in the newsroom, literally, and been doing a heck of a lot of work in order to get it to get their job done. I see I don't have anything up there. Anyway, I'm actually recording something, but it's basically just the desktop with nothing on it. The book it mostly emphasizes what it looks like to be in a big metropolitan newspaper. But actually, in America, the big metropolitan newspapers are like 100 of them. And then there's 10,000 newspapers in the country. So the ones that can afford a really complicated organization, have hundreds of employees in their newsroom, are 100 out of 10,000. And so there are actually some universities that make the same mistake that the authors do, and that is presuming that most journalists will be working for a big newspaper. That's not true. Those big newspapers have relatively few. When you add them all together, they have, if they have, well, New York Times is one of the biggest ones, and its circulation's dropped in half in the last 10 or 12 years. So it has half the circulation it used to have. That's one reason why they're laying people off, which is another issue I wanted to address, is that once the internet starts clobbering your economy, you're going to start losing people on the newspaper. And that's where they demonstrated the concern I have, and that is, how do you continue to do investigative reporting as you start cutting staff and cutting and cutting and cutting? They pride themselves on having good investigative reporters. Now, I would challenge that a lot of their reporting is not very good, frankly, anymore. But that's still, they're trying. They're putting the budget into it, and they're trying to set a priority. We can use fewer copy editors and more reporters. That's basically what they're saying. In most newspapers, editors are the last ones to go. But there does come a point where they have to ask themselves, do we have a newspaper if we don't have reporters? And so they're struggling with this issue. And can they keep going into the red? As I mentioned, McClatchy lost $30 million last year. So they can't even exist if they don't figure out how to balance their budget. New York Times early on took out something like a $400 million loan from a Mexican oligarch, whatever you want to call him, a billionaire from Mexico. They borrowed like $400 million from him, and that was like 10 years ago. And things have gotten worse since then. So if they had just borrowed $400 million 10 years ago, and they've lost another, more than half of their advertising since then, I don't know. I haven't looked at their corporate report, but they can't be doing too well. So that goes back to what I was talking about earlier. How do they save themselves? How do they survive this? The New York Times is trying to get people to pay for their online version of the newspaper. That is very, very hard to do when there's so many other sources of news on the internet. And so whether or not that will work would be very questionable. They give away a few stories a month to everybody, and then they ask you to pay for it. And I don't think very many people are paying for their online version because they haven't added enough. I wrote as part of, I guess I started it as part of a book chapter, but I ended up changing it a little bit. But the idea was how to save the New York Times. I did a conference presentation on it, how to save the New York Times. And one of the questions that related to that was, what do they do with their internet version? And I already talked about some things they could do. Even smaller newspapers could do, but especially the New York Times could start their own TV station. They could start their own TV channel on the internet because they have enough money and they have enough brand that now's the time to do it. If they're not too late, if they haven't gone too far into the hole already, where they can't make up the deficit, their brand is strong enough. They could do lots of things. They could have done lots of things anyway. Whether they can now, I don't know. But I recommended when they still had 900,000 circulation, I recommended that they consider stopping their printed version. Their printed version costs so much money. I may have mentioned this in another class, in the history class, but they're printing the New York Times is so expensive that in 1 year they could afford to give everybody an iPad and say, we will give you the iPad. All you have to do is transfer your circulation or your readership online. And we'll specialize the smart pad, whatever it is, maybe not an iPad, but a smart pad, so that as soon as you turn it on, you have our newspaper, and you can go immediately into our newspaper, just like if we delivered it to your doorstep, but now you do it on a smart pad instead of in print, and we're going to give you the smart pad if you will renew your circulation, renew your subscription for 4 years. We will only charge you once a year, but your contract will be 4 years. We'll give you the iPad. We'll give you the smart pad. The idea, my argument then was if they did it when they had 900,000 circulation, that they could probably have kept 400,000 readers. They might have lost 500,000, but they might have kept 400,000 who were then, over a 4-year period, transfer their reading habit. I mentioned earlier the importance of a reading habit. A brand new newspaper has nobody with a reading habit to read their newspaper. And so that's why the Tampa newspaper that I was working for killed itself by lying to the advertisers about their circulation. So you need people to build a new reading habit and to value that content. So my recommendation of the New York Times, add a lot more content, a lot more video, a lot more, maybe go into education. The Washington Post owns a university, an online university. New York Times could own an online university. They can start doing lots of things, sell books, sell, they have to stop thinking that they're a newspaper. That's what they have to do. And then think of all the spin-off businesses they could start as part of their newspaper, as they're part of their operation now. And their reporters have to think differently. They have to start taking their video cameras out and video recording their interviews. Everything has to change if they're going to survive. And it may be that they're so far in debt now that they can't do it. That they've already killed themselves. That's why Jacob Jarvis, a professor at New York University, suggested they do this, like 15 years ago. Close down your printed product and reinvent yourself online before you go into debt. Don't go into debt to try to save the printed product. If you go into debt to save the printed product, then you will die because you're going to lose advertising, lose advertising, lose advertising. You'll never be able to pay your debt off, and then you'll have to close your doors. That's, I think, what happened to the Seattle PI, Seattle Post-Intelligencer. They were one of the first big metropolitan newspapers that died. And I think it makes no sense. They had 400,000 subscribers. They were bringing in tens of millions of dollars in advertising. How can you just close your doors when you're bringing in tens of millions of dollars in advertising? Well, I think there's two problems that maybe, I don't know, I'm surmising at why they had to close their doors. One thought is that their unions would not cooperate. Labor unions in America sometimes don't get it. They don't understand the business aspect of it. And so they won't take pay cuts. They will fight the layoffs, all this sort of stuff. And what they do is they put the newspaper into a position where they just close the doors. And I think that was probably I know the unions were very strong in Washington State, where Seattle's at. And so I suspect the unions not willing enough to, not being willing to work with the owners and the managers killed the Seattle PI. But the other thing is, have you worked so long at this, have you struggled so long to survive that you've gone into debt, and you know that if you cut off your printed newspaper, there's no way you can pay the debt off with an online version. And that was probably what also happened with the PI, is they just went into too much debt, and then they had no choice but to close their doors, other than just keep going into debt. And so a lot of American newspapers will close their doors, not because they don't have a lot of revenue, but because they haven't figured out how to live within their revenue. And because in the struggle to survive, as in the way that they wanted to survive, they built up so much debt that they know they get to a point where they realize we can never pay off this debt. Our only choice is to close the doors. Those are the problems that are facing the American newspapers right now. Hopefully, some of the newspapers have been wiser than that, and they've avoided debt, even if it meant they had to cut staff earlier in this process. You don't want that to cut. Nobody wants to cut staff. I guarantee you the editors and the owners of a newspaper do not want to cut staff, because that means that they're doing badly, and that means they're going to do worse. It becomes its own tipping point. Right now, the newspaper I used to work for, a lot of people just laugh at it because it's so small, has so few pages that nobody wants to subscribe to it anymore. My sister was telling me that she canceled it. They just kept on delivering it because they didn't want to stop. They needed to keep their circulation up, so they just ignored her canceling the newspaper and kept delivering it anyway. And then they did try to get her to pay for it, even though she had canceled it. So they're struggling. And actually, the newspaper I used to work for is one of the most profitable of the McClatchy newspapers, and it's struggling. So I don't know how many of the 10,000 newspapers will still survive in 10 years, if any of them. I don't know. But I do know they're facing a big problem. And they might, many of them will disappear for sure. Okay. I think what I'm going to do now is I have a little exercise for you. I'm going to pass it out. I want you to spend some time working on this copy editing. I don't want to emphasize copy editing a lot, but I want you to take a few minutes and just work on this. By the way, talking about the proofreading, our newspaper did not print out, well, they did. They printed them out. We did not try to proofread in the detail that is demonstrated, and I doubt that they do either. They are, mostly in our proofreading, we're looking at headlines, and she kind of said that, but at the same time, the example we saw was all these proofreading marks on the side. The copy editor should be better than that. They should be able to catch more errors than what they were showing in that example. So I don't think you typically see very many changes like that suggested in that slide with all the proofreading. So we did print out the pages, and we did proof them, and then we had to sign, whoever proofed it had to sign their initial on it. But we didn't go into the fine-tuned editing that is suggested after it was already done. That had to be done by the copy editor before we ever got to the stage of printing out copies. So if the copy editor missed their style rules and stuff, it was too late to stuff at that point. We didn't have like that. It's a very, very major problem that you can't ignore. So you have the examples of the proofreading marks above it. We'll just go through this story real quick and just try using those proofreading or copy editing marks on the text you have there. You can use pen, pencil, it doesn't matter. And then go ahead and do that, please, and then I'm going to show you the answers to it. We'll talk about how it should have been done in a few minutes. So go ahead and do your best with copy editing that. I just want you to have the practice of doing this. After this, I'm not going to emphasize it at all anymore. Okay, so this is not for grade, but just go ahead and just proofread or copy edit this real quickly, and I'll show you the right answers. So just get used to the copy editing marks. That, like I said, in the future, it may or may not be important to you, but at least they have an experience at copy editing. Language learning and stuff, just writing words or writing it will help you remember it better. And so that's why I wanted you to actually do this. We're not going to emphasize this in this class. I want you to understand copy editing in the traditional sense with the paper and pencil. This is basically when you were looking back in the New York Times PowerPoint, we saw the rim, we saw the copy desk where they had the horseshoe-shaped copy desk and somebody in the middle. They're all doing hand editing with that. And so these were the symbols they were using. They send that back to the person setting the type, and then make that person actually have to do the changes. This was before the computers. By the way, a lot of newspapers resisted the computer for quite a while. When I was in Buffalo, New York in the early 1980s, the Buffalo News was still not using computers. And they were, well, let me see how they do this. They actually had, well, they had some people doing computers to improve it. They did not let the reporters do computers yet. But their staff, I was talking about unions earlier, because they were starting to use computers at some of the positions, some of the people that were working at the paper no longer had a job. And so they were just sitting there reading a book. They're being paid to read a book or whatever they wanted to do. They were doing nothing because their job was eliminated and the union would not allow the newspaper to fire them. So there was a big transition period there where people were trying to figure out what do we do with these darn computers. So looking at the answers, as I did them anyway, I may have missed something. I go ahead and I use the paragraph sign at the start of each one, whether or not it's not really that important if you have an indent, I guess, but I go ahead and, for one thing, it reminds me where I'm at in my editing process, so at the start, when I start one, I go ahead and do that. I noticed there I probably should have put one right in here. That's a long paragraph, and I probably, when I first invented the thing, I probably intended to force somebody to put in a paragraph mark in there, because that paragraph is too long. So I need to change that. Extra S in the past need to be slashed and enclosed, and space and remark, slash, or rather close marks. The space sign after between with and no. T and reported. Wrong spelling is there. The wrong side needs to be the possessive there. First needs to be spelled out. The uppercase A and eagle, lowercase the A. Neoprene needs an E on it, misspelled. This is bigger than 10, so that should be a number. East, in this case, is the direction, not a certain number of miles east of a certain point. Means that that's not a region, that is a direction, so that needs to be lowercase. There's I think a comma there that doesn't need to be there. The zero or the O has to replace the N there, so carry that in. E there wasn't necessary, slash and close. Spokesman, probably nowadays we say spokesperson, which was done before people started getting upset about that. So an A in there instead of E, comma inserted. Northerly, not northernly, northerly, so N comes out, slash and close. Transposition here, land, in D. Space here between Great and Britain. Britain misspelled, need to transpose the I and the A. Extra period, one needs to go. This is where I was talking about a lot of times we'll see you need to be very cognizant of whether somebody's misspelling somebody's name, so you start comparing how they spelled it here, how they spelled it here. This is a more common spelling of Levitt. You wouldn't know that, but at least you need to know there's one of them has to be wrong. You can't spell it two different ways. So obviously, if you're in the copy desk, you're going to try to look it up, ask questions, somehow find out how to spell that name right. And under down, Monday is capitalized, so three lines underneath M. Tuesday capitalized, 3 lines under T. Period at the end. X circled, period circled. Different ways of doing that. An extra O in here as a balloonist, so carried in another O. This is kind of parenthetical, using commas in a parenthetical way. So the balloonist, both from Albuquerque, New York, so you put a comma here and 1 year after New Mexico. This is where I mentioned, I didn't get back to it. In theory, you could put this in parentheses, but you use commas instead to set off this parenthetical information. It is parenthetical. We do call it parenthetical information, but we don't use parentheses. New Mexico is one that would be circled to abbreviate it. A bunch of garbage in here, and you don't want it to be confusing, so you just close it up. Need to put in a T in here. I'm not sure it was before, but it wasn't a T, I guess. Anyway, insert the right letter. Friday, day of the week is uppercase, 3 lines under it. Night is misspelled. You know, we typically do it that way when in kind of our online shorthands. You can't do that as journalists, so you could add some letters, but by the time you start copy editing that way, it's easier to just slash and close and put in the new word. Probably I should have put a caret there and a circle period. Some more garbage, just to show the closure mark. Misspelling is there, transposition, and in there, since, period in. Fall is not uppercase, so that slash just a lowercase. All this garbage goes. Traditionally, at the end of a story, they put a 30 at the end of it and circled it, showing that this is not part of the story, but this shows the end of the story. So when you had when you were handing in printed work, that was to help people know they weren't missing a page. And so they would put a 30 at the end of the printed copy. You know, in your, I mean, I guess it is helpful to make sure if you're copy editing like this, that means you have printed copy. And so it may be that a 30 at the end is important also, possibly, if it's a multi-page, particularly if it's multi-page. But if there's any question that somebody has all the pages, you want to put a 30 at the end to show that this is the end of the story here. Not so important if it's in an electronic format, because it should be obvious if it's in an electronic format. But when you get to a printed format, that's when you start using this stuff, and 30 becomes valuable. Other stuff that's not to be included in the story, sometimes circled also. So this is traditional copy editing. Again, you may never use it, but you should be aware of it. And because you just don't know. Like I say, I use it sometimes, and so you may get a paperback from me using it. And so hopefully you'll understand what I'm doing when I'm circling stuff, putting lines under them and slashing them. You'll understand what I'm doing now, that a slash means lowercase, a 3 lines means capitalized, that sort of stuff. So if you hand a printed assignment into me, you may see me making these marks because I'm used to making them. Because I did kind of grow up with them in the industry. The only other thing I need to remind you is actually your stories, your real stories are due. You have until, you might double check what it says on Moodle, but I think it's like Monday morning at 9 or something. Or maybe I can check real quick myself. So you have until Monday, I believe. Maybe I didn't even put it in yet. Let me see. No, I haven't actually put in the where you would upload it, but it'll be Monday at 9. That's why I remember knowing that's what I think I put it probably in the syllabus. So Monday at 9, your stories are due, so you have the weekend to work on them. But we do need to get those in because next week we start using the computers and start learning Quark Express. And and that means our next assignment is designing a magazine. So we need to move from the news writing stage into the actual design and layout and editing stage. So I said, I think having to write a news story is important for you. It's important to upgrade your skills, also to talk about the reporting process, because as editors you have to be in charge of that stuff. You have to be good writers. You have to understand the reporting process. So that's why I've tried to do these first few weeks. But then starting next week, we're going to get serious about your other editorial responsibilities, which are maybe more, well, they're more thought of as, you may not think of your needing to be a good writer and a good reporter to be a good editor, but you do have to have those skills. Some positions needing those skills more than others. Content editor should be a good reporter, and a copy editor needs to be a good copy editor, obviously. They know how to write. They need to know how to write well. They don't necessarily, a copy editor does not necessarily have to be a good reporter. He may never have been a reporter. Actually, a lot of people, if they're really good with words, they're never a reporter. They go straight into the copy desk. So a copy editor does not have to have a reporting experience, but a content editor should, because his job includes working with reporters. And so if he has never been a reporter, how does he work with reporters? It's very hard for him to do that. So anyway, so we will go now from the reporting process into the other editing processes, including the copy editing and the design, headline writing, photo editing, all that sort of stuff that you have to do to put out a good publication. So, okay, well, we're out of time. Thank you.